The best way to understand yourself is having someone in your corner. Coaches can help you understand yourself by providing an angle on your issues. For more information on coaching and a way to sign up for our waitlist, click the first link in the description.
Hey guys, Dr. K here. So today I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about non-clinical depression, or what I call congruent depression. Now this is kind of a weird video because in this series on depression, so far we may have focused a lot on like clinical depression, or what we think of as an illness, right? So let's just stop for a second and kind of think through this. So depression right now, like in the world, and certainly in developed countries, seems to be getting worse. And why is that? So it's my belief that a lot of people are depressed, certainly people are getting depressed, and then they go to see a psychiatrist, and then a psychiatrist may diagnose them with an illness, right? They say that something about you is broken or ill, and then they'll provide for them treatment like medication. And part of the reason that I think depression is getting worse is that even though people are seeing more psychiatrists, not all of the depression that people experience is an illness. And somewhere along the way, as a society, we started assuming that if you're depressed, that also means you're ill. So let's think about that and kind of take a step back and try to understand, what is illness? And is it possible for a depression for you to be depressed, but it not be some kind of malfunction? And I think once we think through that, we'll start to see like how to move forward if we're not actually ill or malfunctioning. So the first thing to think about is that an illness is like a malfunction. It's something in your body that isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. So if we think about, let's say, like getting the common cold, our nose is sometimes supposed to produce mucus, and sometimes we're supposed to cough if maybe we get something stuck in our throat. But when we get ill with a cold, our body starts to produce way more mucus than normal, and it starts to cough when maybe it's not supposed to. And so we can kind of think about that as an illness. It's the body not working the way it's supposed to. If we think about blood pressure, so our blood pressure is supposed to stay within a particular range, and then when we get something like hypertension, our blood pressure rises above what it's supposed to do. So that too is a malfunction. And sometimes our brain malfunctions and we end up with clinical depression. And so what that means is that what that really means is that your brain is malfunctioning compared to what you are supposed to be doing. So if your life is going really well and like you have a good job and maybe you're in a relationship and there are people in your life who care about you, and at the same time you wake up every day and you feel sort of sad and empty, that's more consistent with a clinical depression, because we look at this person's life and we say, this person should be happy. And if they should be happy and they're waking up every day and they're sad, that implies to me that there's a malfunction. And if something is broken, that also implies a particular way that we're supposed to fix it. So in this person, maybe their serotonin system is malfunctioning or their serotonin is low, which is why we can consider doing something like giving them medication. And then if we correct that sort of serotonin imbalance, they start to live the normal life that they're supposed to. But the tricky thing is that not everyone who's depressed should be happy, right? And in fact, if we really stop and think about it, a lot of people who are depressed maybe should be depressed. And what I mean by that is that it's actually normal, or I like to use the word congruent, with your situation. If you're stuck in life, if you don't have a job, you don't have a fulfilling romantic relationship, you're kind of socially isolated, it's almost like you're supposed to feel depressed in that kind of situation. So unlike clinical depression, congruent depression is kind of like appropriate to your situation. Now, this gets tricky because clinical depression can come out of something that is like, not good in your life. Like if you lose your job, you can sort of get a clinical depression that's triggered by a bad circumstance. But the key factor there is that if the bad circumstance is fixed, someone with congruent depression will start to feel better. And someone with clinical depression, now that the clinical episode has been triggered, it has a lifespan of its own that's independent of its circumstances. So if we think about clinical depression, once again, it's episodic. So it has a start and it has a finish. Congruent depression can be more long-lasting, can last for years or even your entire life, and is sort of related to like major shortcomings in your life. So sometimes people will come into my office and they'll say, I've been depressed ever since I was 15, and they're like 30 years old. So they've been depressed every day since they were 15. When I think about that person and I talk to that person, I don't think about a neurochemical imbalance, which has been sort of off for 15 years. I think that this person is depressed because there's something in their life that's fundamentally lacking. So people who have congruent depression oftentimes have a life that lacks purpose. They lack motivation because there's like no end goal that they're moving towards. They sort of feel loneliness, and sometimes they feel paralyzed by their loneliness. They feel stuck. They feel like they're living their life on autopilot. Their life can feel like a blur, like you're fast forwarding through your life with video games, substances, binge watching shows, social media. Like you wake up every day and you just engage with devices or things that affect your dopamine system without actually like living life. It's just like a blur. One day becomes the next. One day becomes a week. 1 week becomes a month. 1 month becomes a year. One year becomes 3 years. And you don't know what you're doing. It's almost like you kind of become this zombie. People who feel like they're behind when they're comparing themselves to other people, like, they look at all these other people who are way more successful than them, and for years and years and years, they feel more behind, more behind, more behind. Now, is that a problem? Absolutely. Is it depression? Absolutely. But is it a brain malfunction? I'm not so sure. And that's the idea behind a congruent depression. I think some of the depression we experience in life isn't actually our brain malfunctioning. It's our brain functioning the way that it's sort of supposed to. Or it's our brain doing the best to be adaptive, which can sometimes cause us problems. But it's almost like an appropriate depression, or as if it's congruent to our circumstances. And so, like, if we think about that, we kind of have to take a step back and we have to ask ourselves, like, why, if sadness and depression aren't a malfunction, then what is their function? And that begs the question, why have our brains evolved to experience sadness or depression in the first place? Why do we even have negative emotions? And it turns out that sadness and depression are our brain's way of signaling to us that we need to fix something in our life, right? Like if we feel lonely, that's sort of, if you take it the average person, let's not talk about someone who really has congruent depression, but if we think about just in general, the feeling of loneliness. Why does our brain have the feeling of loneliness? And that's because it's our brain's way of telling us like, hey, we need to connect with other human beings. And then usually people who feel lonely will reach out to someone, or they'll, call their friends, or they'll reach out to their parents, or they'll message their gaming buddies, and then you'll get together. And then that loneliness kind of goes away. A lot of negative feelings that we have, negative emotions or feelings of depression, are actually our brain or our being, our self way of like giving us a compass to move forward and make a positive change in life. Dissatisfaction with ourselves helps us learn what our compass is and helps us actually move forward. Loneliness actually pulls us towards other people. Feeling like you're lacking purpose is your brain's way of telling you to like, hey, like, let's go do something because this life is not cutting it for us right now. So like, if these things are sort of good for us, then like, what's the problem, right? Why don't we just feel, it's kind of weird, but like, what's the problem with this? If this is our compass, like, isn't that a good thing? And this is where I think we get into some really tricky stuff, which is that these signals from our brain used to have easy solutions. And I think the reason that we suffer now is because they don't really have solutions that used to be simple like they were. Remember that our brains and our, emotions and things like that evolved millions of years ago and were sort of like designed for a more simple lifestyle. Like if you think about, loneliness and connection, like I'm Indian, and like 1,000, even 50 years ago, in India, there used to be arranged marriages. So romantic loneliness was like, in a sense, less of an issue, kind of, or I'm sort of making that claim, because like, your partner or your spouse was kind of chosen for you by your family anyway. And like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, it's not like things are today with Tinder where like, you have to meet 1,000 people and like 999 of them reject you. There isn't that same sense of rejection because our society has started to evolve in a particular way that is leaving our brains and our evolutionary like emotional circuitry kind of behind. Our brain and evolution just can't keep pace with the rapid change of society. So these compasses, these feelings that we used to have, generally speaking, easier solutions. But I think the solutions have gotten more difficult, and it's harder to actually figure out how to move forward. Another good example of this is like, if you think about, let's say, once again, in India, if you go back 200 years, there used to be a caste system. So you were sort of born into a caste, and your job was kind of determined by what your family's job is. There wasn't really like much choice. Like finding purpose in your life was like pretty simple because, your dad is a farmer, his dad was a farmer, your mom is a farmer, her mom was a farmer, y'all are all farmers. So what are you going to do? You're going to be a farmer. And so in a sense, things were a little bit more simple. Whereas now, if you're lacking purpose, like there isn't a clear answer how you go about finding it. And what that means is that you wake up every day and you're kind of feeling depressed, and it's almost like congruent with your life because your life actually doesn't have a whole lot of purpose. You're not really doing anything that benefits the world in a profound way. So like that's how you should feel in a bizarre way. And so I'm not saying that, it sort of makes sense to me why congruent depression happens. That doesn't mean that we need to accept it or that we shouldn't fix it. In fact, quite the opposite. I think actually a big part of why we're even making these videos is to help people understand that if you wake up and you feel depressed because you have no reason to get out of bed in the morning, the solution to that may not be to go see a psychiatrist and get started on a medication. The solution is to learn in our current world how you go about finding purpose, how you go about finding meaning, how you go about discovering the nature of motivation and where it comes from. And so in order to do that, we have to dig into a lot of really important questions, like where purpose comes from, how to start comparing to others, how to stop comparing to others and start living your own life, how fantasies keep us stuck, where hope comes from, how to overcome hopelessness, how to develop confidence. And what the challenge here is that like what's happened is as we sort of medicalize depression, we stopped looking for answers to all of those questions. And we started saying, oh, your problem is that you have a neurochemical imbalance. So here's a pill to fix that. And so our society has been sort of focusing on the medical definition of depression as we sort of study neurochemistry and we have pharmacology companies that are coming out with new drugs. We put so much emphasis in that direction that we've stopped asking ourselves these questions. And I think that if you're depressed, there are two options, right? One is that your brain is malfunctioning, and the other is that it's functioning perfectly fine. And in either case, there's certainly a way forward. In the case of a malfunction, we want to correct the malfunction. But in case of a congruent depression, we need to start answering some of those questions, right? Like, where does depression come from? What are all of the things that I'm feeling? What are all of the ways in which depression manifests in my life? There could be a neurochemical imbalance. There could be like a lack of spirituality or a lack of purpose in your life. So we have to differentiate these out because if we use pills to fix all that, it's not going to work for half of it. And that's the whole reason to think about a congruent depression. So in your case, if you've been feeling depressed for years and have these like big issues that make you unhappy in life, certainly psychotherapy or seeing like a therapist could help, but chances are your solution is actually going to be in finding purpose, in finding meaning, in understanding yourself better, in sort of fixing your loneliness, developing confidence. And we're going to dive into that as well.